Imagine looking up, not at a sky you recognize, not the sky above a city or a field or an ocean you know. A Duyuran sky, the sky of the late Cretaceous world 68 million years ago. Warmer than ours, thicker with humidity, the blue of it deeper perhaps, or the clouds arranged diurnally, we cannot know exactly, but a sky, a real sky over a real landscape of rivers and forests and open plains. You are looking up because something has moved across the sun. Not a cloud, not a bird, something much larger, something that blocks the light in the way that a very large thing does when it passes between you and the sun. Not a flicker, not a shadow, but a genuine dimming, a momentary eclipse that lasts long enough to make you look. And when you look, you see it. A wingspan wider than the nose to tail length of a city bus. A long, crested head extending forward from a neck the length of a tall person. 4 limbs folded against a body that is both enormous and impossibly light. Wings of leathery membrane taut against the wind, generating lift in the way that only the most extraordinary biological engineering can generate it. It rides the thermal without a wing beat, without EUOT, with the casual, uncanny ease of an animal that has been shaped by tens of millions of years of evolution for exactly this, for moving through the air at altitude, covering distance at a rate that would embarrass most modern aircraft in terms of endurance, crossing continents in a body that weighs no more than a large human being. It is the largest flying animal that has ever existed. Its name, when we finally gave it one, was taken from an Aztec god, a feathered serpent, a deity of wind and air, Quetzalcoatlus. 100 facts, let us begin. The name Quetzalcoatlus comes from Quetzalcoatl, one of the principal deities of the Aztec pantheon, whose name in Nahuatl combines Quetzali, meaning the green feathers of the Quetzal bird, and Coatl, meaning serpent. The feathered serpent, the plumed wind deity, the god of the morning star, of creativity, of the boundaries between earth and sky. It is one of the most evocative names in all of paleontology, and one of the most fitting. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, the species that bears this name, was an animal of the boundary between earth and sky in a literal and profound sense. It walked on the earth, on 4 limbs, in a gait unlike any modern animal. And it flew in the sky, on wings wider than those of any other flying animal in the history of life. It occupied both worlds, and neither fully. It was the bridge, enormous, strange, aerodynamically improbable, and completely real, between the terrestrial and the aerial. The feathered serpent, yes, the name fits. The species name Northropi honors John Nelson Northrop, the American aircraft designer and founder of the Northrop Corporation, whose innovative work on flying wing aircraft designs in the mid-20th century represented, in the eyes of the scientists who named the pterosaur, a parallel attempt to solve the same fundamental engineering challenge: how to build a large, efficient flying machine. A pterosaur named after an aircraft engineer. The connection is apt in ways that go beyond mere homage. Quetzalcoatlus was discovered in 1971 in Big Bend National Park in the Trans-Pecos region of southwest Texas. The discovery was made by a geology graduate student named Douglas Lawson, who was doing field work in the Javelina Formation, a late Cretaceous geological unit that preserves sediments deposited on the floodplains and river systems of the ancient interior of North America. Lawson found a large, hollow bone eroding out of the rock, a bone too large and too thin-walled to belong to any dinosaur he was familiar with. He brought it to the attention of his academic supervisor, one Langston Jr., at the University of Texas at Austin, one of the foremost vertebrate paleontologists in America at the time. Langston immediately recognized the significance of what Lawson had found. The bone was a wing bone from a pterosaur, and it was enormous. Further excavation revealed additional material, more wing bones, parts of the neck vertebrae, fragmentary skull material. Not a complete skeleton, not even close to a complete skeleton, but enough to establish that this was a pterosaur of size far beyond anything previously known. In 1975, Lawson formally described the new genus and species in the journal Science, a brief paper as appropriate for such a landmark discovery that named Quetzalcoatlus northropi and provided the first scientific description of the animal that would come to be recognized as the largest flying creature in the history of life on Earth. A graduate student, a field trip, a bone eroding out of the rock in the Texas Badlands. One of the most significant paleontological discoveries of the 20th century. There are two species of Quetzalcoatlus currently recognized by science, and their relationship to each other tells an interesting story about the ecology of giant therosaurs in the late Cretaceous world. The first species, Quetzalcoatlus northropi, is the giant, the animal whose wingspan estimates have ranged from 10 to 12 meters, roughly 33 to 40 feet, and whose fragmentary remains from Big Bend represent the largest individual pterosaur bones ever found. Despite its fame, Q. northropi is known from frustratingly incomplete material. The original specimens are all fragmentary. No complete skull, no complete skeleton, no unambiguous association of all the elements that would allow a fully confident reconstruction. The second species, Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, named in honor of the original discoverer, is known from much more complete material, also from Big Bend National Park, found in the same geological formation. Q. lawsoni was substantially smaller than Q. northropi, with a wingspan of approximately 5 to 6 meters, roughly half the linear dimension, and perhaps 1/8 the mass of the giant species. Q. lawsoni was formally described only in 2021, a paper by Brian Andres and colleagues that provided the most comprehensive treatment of Quetzalcoatlus material since Lawson's original 1975 description. The 2021 paper significantly advanced our understanding of both species, providing detailed anatomical descriptions, revised size estimates, and the first rigorous phylogenetic analysis of the genus in the context of the broader Asdocid family. Two species, one enormous, one merely very large, both from the same formation, the same region, the same geological moment. Why two species of the same genus in the same place? The answer almost certainly lies in ecological separation. The two species were not direct competitors because they were not the same size and therefore not targeting the same prey. The giant and the merely large sharing a late Cretaceous floodplain. Quetzalcoatlus was not a dinosaur. This is the correction that must be made early and clearly because the popular imagination consistently conflates the two. Therosaurs and dinosaurs coexisted. They shared the same geological periods, the same landscapes, sometimes the same fossil formations. They are often displayed together in museums and depicted together in films, but they were not the same kind of animal. Dinosaurs are defined by a specific set of anatomical features, particularly a specific arrangement of the hip joint, that unite them as a distinct evolutionary group. Therosaurs lack these features. They are archosaurs, members of the broader group that also includes dinosaurs and modern birds and crocodilians, but they represent a separate lineage of archosaur evolution, one that diverged from the lineage leading to dinosaurs in the Triassic period, perhaps 240 to 245 million years ago. The therosaurs were the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight. Before them, no vertebrate animal, no fish, no amphibian, no reptile had ever flown under its own power. The insects had been flying for over 150 million years by the time the first pterosaur took to the air. But among the vertebrates, the pterosaurs were the pioneers. And they remained pioneers, masters of the air, the dominant flying vertebrates, for over 150 million years, from the late Triassic until the very end of the Cretaceous, when they shared the skies with the early birds that would eventually replace them. Quetzalcoatlus was not a dinosaur. It was something older and stranger, a member of the first great lineage of flying vertebrates, a creature of the air in a way that the terrestrial dinosaurs could never be. The wingspan of Quetzalcoatlus northropi, the giant species, has been estimated by diurent researchers at diurent values, and the uncertainty in those estimates reflects the genuine incompleteness of the fossil material. The original estimates, based on Lawson's initial description and on scaling from the fragmentary wing bones available, suggested a wingspan of approximately 11 to 12 meters. Later analyses, using more sophisticated scaling methods and additional comparative material from related Asdarchid pterosaurs, have suggested values ranging from 9 to 12 meters, with most researchers converging on approximately 10 to 11 meters as the most defensible estimate. 10 to 11 meters, let us make that concrete. The wingspan of a wandering albatross, the largest living flying bird, reaches approximately 3.5 meters. The wingspan of a California condor, the largest flying bird in North America, reaches approximately 3 meters. A Quetzalcoatlus northropi, at 10 to 11 meters, had a wingspan 3 to 4 times that of the largest flying bird alive today. The wingspan of a Cessna 172, a small single-engine aircraft of the kind used for training and recreation worldwide, is approximately 11 meters. The wingspan of Quetzalcoatlus was, at its upper estimate, approximately equal to that of a small aircraft. An animal with the wingspan of an aircraft, flying under its own power over the late Cretaceous plains of what is now Texas. The engineering of it is, even now, almost impossible to believe. The weight of Quetzalcoatlus is one of the most debated aspects of its biology, and the debate matters enormously because weight is the fundamental variable in the physics of flight. Flight requires generating lift equal to the animal's weight. The lift generated by a wing depends on the wing area, the airspeed, and the angle of attack, the angle at which the wing meets the air. For a very large animal, the weight increases with the cube of linear dimensions, while wing area increases only with the square. This means that as flying animals get larger, they require disproportionately large wings or disproportionately high airspeeds, or both, simply to stay airborne. This scaling problem sets a physical upper limit on how large a flying animal can be. Beyond a certain size, no amount of wing area or airspeed can generate enough lift to keep the animal in the air. Quetzalcoatlus northropi appears to have been very close to, or possibly at that physical limit. Weight estimates for Quetzalcoatlus have ranged from as low as 70 kilograms to as high as 540 kilograms, reflecting the genuine uncertainty in how to extrapolate the mass of the soft tissue from fragmentary skeletal material. The most widely cited middle-range estimates cluster around 200 to 250 kilograms for the giant species, roughly the weight of a very large human being or a small motorcycle. 250 kilograms on a wingspan of 10 to 11 meters. The extreme lightness of this, a bird the size of a small aircraft, weighing less than 2 large adult humans, reflects the extraordinary engineering of the pterosaur body. Every gram of unnecessary weight was, evolutionarily speaking, a liability, and the pterosaur skeleton had been stripped of unnecessary weight by millions of years of selection pressure in ways that we are still discovering. The skeleton of Quetzalcoatlus was, by the standards of the bones we are used to studying, almost impossibly light. The bones of large therosaurs were hollow, not merely marrow-filled hollow, as the long bones of most vertebrates are, but pneumatized hollow, filled with air, laced with a complex internal architecture of thin struts and walls, arranged to provide maximum structural strength with minimum material. This pneumatization was not unique to pterosaurs. Modern birds have pneumatized bones for the same reason, reducing weight to make flight possible. But in Quetzalcoatlus, the pneumatization was taken to an extreme beyond anything in modern birds. The wall thickness of the wing bones of large therosaurs has been measured in some specimens at less than a millimeter, thinner than a credit card. The hollow interior of a Quetzalcoatlus cutemus, the upper wing bone, was so large relative to the total bone diameter that the bone was euctively a thin-walled tube, structurally comparable to bamboo cane, strong in bending and torsion despite using barely any material. This bamboo tube architecture is one of the most elegant structural solutions in the history of biological engineering. A tube resists bending forces usually because the material is distributed at the maximum possible distance from the central axis, where it contributes most to the tube's resistance to flexing. The hollow wing known of Quetzalcoatlus maximized this urgency to a degree that no engineer, designing from first principles without the benefit of 200 million years of evolutionary refinement, would have achieved. The skeleton of Quetzalcoatlus was a masterpiece of structural minimalism, light enough to fly, strong enough to survive. The wing of Quetzalcoatlus was structured very deliberately from the wing of a bird, and understanding that durance is essential to understanding how this animal flew. A bird's wing is supported by a modified forelimb, the humerus, radius, and ulna, leading to the hand bones, which support the primary flight feathers. The wing membrane in a bird is feathers overlapping, individually replaceable, aerodynamically sophisticated, but fundamentally separate from the arm itself. A pterosaur wing was diurent in its fundamental architecture. The primary supporting structure of the wing membrane was a single enormously elongated fourth finger. The ring finger, in human terms, extended to extraordinary length, forming the leading edge of the wing and the primary support for the membrane. The other three fingers remained short and functional, used for gripping and for walking on the ground. The wing membrane itself, the patagium, extended from this elongated fourth finger to the body, and in most pterosaur species also from the body to the hind limb. It was not feathers. It was a sheet of skin and muscle, complex in its internal structure, capable of active shape control through the contraction of embedded muscle fibers. The ability to actively control the shape of the wing membrane, to adjust its camber and tension in response to changing aerodynamic conditions, gave pterosaurs a degree of flight control that may have exceeded that of birds in some respects. The wing was not a passive surface. It was an active, responsive, dynamically controlled aerodynamic instrument. The neck of Quetzalcoatlus is, in its own way, as extraordinary as the wings. In Kunanthropy, the neck was composed of elongated cervical vertebrae, neck bones, that were extraordinarily long relative to their diameter. The total neck length in the giant species has been estimated at approximately 2.5 to 3 meters, a neck longer than the entire body of many large animals alive today. But this neck was not flexible in the way that, say, a swan's neck is flexible. It was largely rigid, a long stye letter 1B0 rod extending from the body to the head, capable of some movement but not the serpentine flexibility that the neck's length might suggest. The rigidity was structural. The elongated vertebrae articulated with each other in a way that limited rotation and lateral bending, producing a neck that held its shape under the aerodynamic forces of flight. In the air, a flexible neck would have been a liability, a structure that vibrated and oscillated unpredictably, destabilizing the animal's flight. A rigid neck was the aerodynamic solution. On the ground, the rigid neck was the hunting tool. Extended forward and downward from the body, it placed the long skull of Quetzalcoatlus at the optimal distance from the body for reaching prey on the ground, for the terrestrial hunting style that we will discuss shortly. The neck of Quetzalcoatlus was simultaneously a flight stabilizer and a hunting instrument, a single structure serving two radically different functions, optimized for each by the same evolutionary process. The skull of Quetzalcoatlus was long, narrow, and toothless. Long, the skull of Kunanthropy, reconstructed from fragmentary material supplemented by comparison with related asdarchids, has been estimated at up to 2.5 meters in the giant species. A skull longer than a tall human being is standing. Narrow, the skull was laterally compressed, like the blade of a very long, very thin knife, not deep or robust, as in the skull of a large predatory dinosaur, but slender and aerodynamically shaped. Toothless, there were no teeth. The jaws terminated in a sharp-edged beak, keratinous and hard-pointed, entirely analogous in function to the beak of a modern heron or stork, not for crushing, not for gripping, for precision strikes, for the rapid, targeted delivery of the beak tip to a specific point, followed by the capture of whatever was at that point. In many agdacid pterosaurs, including the better-known relatives of Quetzalcoatlus, there was also a distinctive crest rising from the back of the skull, a bony projection of varying size and shape, covered in life by a keratinous extension that increased its visual prominence. The function of this crest was almost certainly primarily display. Like the frill of Triceratops or the crests of many hadrosaurs, the skull crest of hadrosaur pterosaurs was probably a species recognition signal, a sexual display structure, or both. The specific shape of the crest varied between species and possibly between sexes within species, providing visual information about the identity and status of the individual displaying it. A 2.5-meter toothless skull with a colorful crest on the end of a 3-meter rigid neck on an animal with the wingspan of a small aircraft. The visual impact of a flying Quetzalcoatlus, seen at close range, must have been extraordinary. For most of the history of pterosaur research, the large asdarchid pterosaurs like Quetzalcoatlus were depicted primarily as aquatic or semi-aquatic animals that spent most of their time near water, feeding on fish in the way that modern pelicans or gannets feed. One popular reconstruction, skimming feeding, imagined the pterosaur skimming the surface of water with its lower jaw trailing in the water, catching fish in the manner of modern skimmer birds. The long, narrow jaw seemed compatible with this feeding mode at first glance. But detailed biomechanical analysis has shown that skim feeding was almost certainly not how Quetzalcoatlus hunted. The forces on the jaw during skim feeding, from the drag of the lower jaw cutting through water, would have been enormous at the scale of Quetzalcoatlus, far exceeding the structural strength of the slender jaw. The jaw would have broken. It was not built for this. The modern understanding of Quetzalcoatlus and the large asdarchids is very diurent. They were, in the most informed current reconstruction, primarily terrestrial hunters, animals that spent most of their time on the ground, walking through the late Cretaceous landscape in search of prey, and hunting in a manner analogous to a giant modern stork or secretary bird. The terrestrial storker hypothesis holds that Quetzalcoatlus moved through the floodplains and forests of the late Cretaceous on its four limbs, using its long neck and precise beak to probe for and strike at small animals, lizards, small mammals, insects, hatchling dinosaurs, small vertebrates of various kinds, in the manner of a modern ground-feeding bird. This interpretation is supported by multiple lines of evidence. The limb proportions of asdarchid pterosaurs are consistent with euyoution quadrupedal walking on solid ground. The neck geometry places the head at exactly the right distance from the body for a ground-stalking feeding strategy. The jaw mechanics are consistent with precision strikes at small prey, not with skim feeding or surface plunging. Quetzalcoatlus walked the late Cretaceous landscape. It was a terrestrial predator first and a flyer second. The flight was the means of travel, the extraordinary, euyoution, long-distance locomotion that allowed it to cover vast areas of the Cretaceous world in search of the patches of habitat and prey that sustained it. The feeding happened on the ground. How did Quetzalcoatlus walk? The locomotion of large theropods on the ground has been reconstructed from trackways and fossilized footprints left by therosols in soft sediment, which preserve the pattern of foot placement, and in some cases the impressions of the folded wing tips, and from detailed analysis of the limb joint geometry. What these sources tell us is that theropods walked quadrupedally, on four limbs, in a gait that has no precise modern equivalent. The hind feet were placed in a roughly bipedal pattern, with the long axis of each foot roughly parallel to the direction of travel. The forelimbs were placed with the hand, specifically the three short, clawed fingers, touching the ground, while the enormously elongated fourth finger, the wing support, was folded upward and backward, keeping the primary wing structure clear of the ground. The resulting gait was something like a knuckle-walking great ape, but more upright, more euyoution, and covering ground with surprising speed. Estimates of walking speed for large pterosaurs, based on trackway analysis, suggests something in the range of 3 to 5 kilometers per hour, a brisk walking pace comparable to a healthy human. On the ground, Quetzalcoatlus would have been an imposing presence. Standing upright, the giant species reached perhaps 5 to 6 meters in height at the top of the crest, taller than a giraffe. The long neck extended forward from the body, the crested head carried at the end of it sweeping slowly from side to side, scanning the ground ahead for the movement that would trigger a strike. It was not elegant in the way that a walking bird is elegant. It was ungainly in the way that very large things are ungainly when they move on the ground. But it was Euclid. And when it found what it was looking for, when the long neck swung forward and the beak struck, it was fast. Itakeo letter 1B0 of Quetzalcoatlus is one of the most analyzed and debated topics in pterosaur biomechanics, because the physics of getting an animal of this mass into the air from a standing start on flat ground presents genuine challenges that require careful engineering analysis to resolve. Modern large flying birds take O letter 1B0 by running into the wind or by leaping from elevated positions. A California condor needs to run several steps before achieving flight speed and strongly prefers Cly letter 1B0 edge launches. An albatross needs a long-running start and favors windy conditions. Neither strategy immediately seems applicable to an animal of Quetzalcoatlus's mass. The solution that biomechanical analysis has converged on is a biphasic vault, a Itakeo letter 1B0 powered primarily by the forelimbs rather than the hindlimbs. In this model, the pterosaur crouches, then uses its powerful forelimb muscles to vault upward and forward, essentially performing a massive push-up that propels the body into the air. As the body rises, the wings unfold and begin generating lift. The hindlimbs contribute to the initial push, but the primary impulse comes from the arms. This vault mechanism requires powerful forearm muscles, which is consistent with the large muscle attachment areas visible on pterosaur forearm bones. It is also consistent with the trackway evidence, which shows no evidence of the running Itakeo letter 1B0 that would be needed if the hindlimbs were the primary Itakeo letter 1B0 mechanism. Quetzalcoatlus, preparing for Itakeo letter 1B0, crouched briefly, gathered itself, then vaulted upward in a fraction of a second, the wings snapping open as the body rose, the aerodynamic forces taking over from the muscular impulse within the first few wing beats. It went from standing to airborne in moments, and once airborne, everything changed. In the air, Quetzalcoatlus was transformed. The ungainly ground locomotion, the slow scanning head movements, the clumsy folded wings, all of it became irrelevant. In the air, those same wings unfolded to their full 11 meters, taut with aerodynamic tension, generating lift with an efficiency that decades of engineering analysis have confirmed was extraordinary. Computer models of Quetzalcoatl's flight, developed using the same aerodynamic software applied to the design of modern aircraft, suggest performance characteristics that are genuinely impressive even by modern standards. Cruise speed, the speed at which Quetzalcoatlus would most efficiently cover distance, has been estimated at approximately 80 to 130 kilometers per hour, that is 50 to 80 miles per hour, faster than a peregrine falcon's level flight speed, significantly faster than any modern soaring bird. Cruise altitude, the altitude at which thermal soaring was most efficient, has been estimated at approximately 4,500 meters above the Cretaceous sea level, with excursions up to perhaps 6,000 meters possible during particularly favorable thermal conditions. Range, the distance that Quetzalcoatlus could cover in a single non-stop flight, has been estimated in some models at more than 10,000 kilometers. 10,000 kilometers without landing, without eating, without drinking, crossing oceans and continents on stored energy, riding thermals and favorable winds, covering a third of the Earth's circumference on a single flight. These figures are, of course, estimates, models based on incomplete anatomical data and aerodynamic assumptions that may not perfectly reflect the reality of a living animal. They have uncertainty ranges. But even at the conservative end of those ranges, Quetzalcoatlus was one of the most capable long-distance flyers in the history of vertebrate life. The thermal soaring that Quetzalcoatlus used as its primary means of sustained flight is a mode of locomotion that requires almost no muscular EUOT once the animal is airborne in the right conditions. A thermal is a column of warm air rising from a sun-heated surface. As the air rises in the thermal, anything light enough to float in rising air, a dust particle, a bubble of gas, a soaring bird, a gliding pterosaur, is carried upward with it. By circling within the thermal, gaining altitude with each circuit, an animal can climb thousands of meters above the ground without a single wing beat. When the thermal weakens, as the bird or pterosaur exits the rising column and begins to glide, it loses altitude, but covers horizontal distance rapidly, gliding at a favorable angle between the heights. When it reaches the next thermal, the process begins again. This soaring and gliding strategy is used today by condors, vultures, eagles, frigate birds, and many other large-winged birds. It is extraordinarily efficient. A large vulture can cover hundreds of kilometers in a day at minimal energetic cost, simply by reading the sky for thermals and positioning itself within them. Quetzalcoatlus, with its enormous wingspan and relatively low wing loading, the ratio of weight to wing area, was ideally suited for this style of flight, perhaps even better suited than any modern soaring bird, because its absolute wing area was so much greater. Its ability to detect and utilize weak thermals was correspondingly enhanced, and its long-distance soaring capability was therefore extraordinary. It read the sky, it found the thermals, it rose and circled and glided and rose again. Across the late Cretaceous landscape, for hundreds of kilometers, for days at a time, without landing. The world that Quetzalcoatlus flew over was the world of the very end of the Cretaceous, the same world that Triceratops and T-Rex inhabited on the ground below. The same world we have visited in previous episodes, but seen now from 5,000 meters above it. From that altitude, the landscape of late Cretaceous North America spread out beneath the pterosaur like a map. The rivers, braided, slow, gleaming in the sun, running south and east across the broad floodplains. The forests along the river margins, darker than the open ground, dense with the late Cretaceous vegetation that was just beginning to include flowering trees and shrubs. The open areas where herds of large herbivores, hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, moved in the characteristic patterns of large herd animals, their tracks visible from above as networks of compressed paths radiating from water sources. From this altitude, the late Cretaceous world was a patchwork of green and brown and blue, stretching to every horizon, unmarked by any human feature, alive in every direction with the activity of the most diverse large animal fauna the planet has produced in the last 100 million years. Quetzalcoatlus saw all of this, not with the interpretive apparatus of a human mind, not with curiosity or wonder or the naming of things, but with the sensory precision of a large flying animal reading its landscape for the features that mattered: thermals, rising columns of warm air marked by the behavior of smaller birds and by the visual shimmer of heated ground. Water reflecting the sky from far below. Open ground, where terrestrial prey was visible from altitude as small, moving forms against the background of soil and vegetation. It was not sightseeing, it was navigation, practical, efficient, purposeful navigation of a landscape it knew through some combination of memory and sensory reading, as well as any modern migratory bird knows its migration route. But the landscape it navigated was one we have never seen, and the view from 5,000 meters over late Cretaceous North America is one of the most extraordinary views in the history of life on Earth. What did Quetzalcoatlus eat? We established that the terrestrial storka hypothesis is the current best explanation for its feeding ecology, that it walked on the ground, using its long neck and precision beak to strike at small prey. But the specifics of what that prey was are worth exploring in more detail. The late Cretaceous floodplains of what is now Texas were rich in small vertebrates of many kinds. Small lizards, numerous and diverse, occupied the ground cover and the low vegetation. Small mammals, the ancestors of the great mammalian radiation that would follow the KPG extinction, lived in burrows and beneath leaf litter. Juvenile dinosaurs, hatchlings and small juveniles of the hadrosaurs and ceratopsians, and small theropods that occupied the same landscape, were abundant in the nesting season, small enough to be taken by a predator with a precise, long-necked strike. Small crocodilians, frogs, large insects. The diversity of small vertebrates available on a late Cretaceous floodplain was enormous, and Quetzalcoatlus, with its precision beak and its extraordinary range of movement, covering hundreds of kilometers between feeding sites, was positioned to exploit all of them. There is also the possibility of scavenging. A large flying animal with a long-range soaring capability and excellent vision from altitude is ideally positioned to locate large carcasses, a dead sauropod visible from kilometers away, for example, and to arrive at those carcasses before ground-based competitors. Modern condors and vultures use exactly this strategy, the soaring flight that allows vast areas to be scanned from altitude, combined with the efficiency of consuming food that requires no hunting art. Quetzalcoatlus may have been both an active hunter of small prey on the ground and an opportunistic scavenger of large carcasses in the air, using the respective advantages of its terrestrial and aerial modes to exploit diurent food resources as they became available. Adaptable, opportunistic, covering enormous distances between resources. This is the ecology of a generalist predator operating at the largest possible scale, an animal for which the relevant spatial scale is not the local hunting territory, but the continent. The sensory world of Quetzalcoatlus was, like that of all pterosaurs, understood primarily through the study of the brain, the endocast, the preserved impression of the brain's shape in the surrounding bone of the skull. Pterosaur brains have been studied in considerable detail through CT scanning of skulls, and the results consistently show a pattern that distinguishes them clearly from their dinosaurian contemporaries. The most striking feature of the pterosaur brain is the very large size of the cerebellum, the region responsible for motor coordination, balance, and the processing of sensory information related to movement and spatial orientation. In Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives, the cerebellum is disproportionately large relative to the rest of the brain, suggesting an animal with extraordinary spatial awareness, exquisite balance, and highly precise motor control. This makes perfect sense. Flying requires continuous, real-time processing of spatial information. The position of the body in three-dimensional space, the attitude of the wings relative to the wind, the moment-to-moment adjustments of the flight surfaces needed to maintain stable, controlled flight. All of this requires a cerebellum of extraordinary capability. The large cerebellum of pterosaurs is the neural hardware for flight. The olfactory bulbs, the smell-processing regions, were relatively small compared to the cerebellum, suggesting that smell was not the primary sensory modality. This again makes sense for a flying animal. At altitude, chemical gradients are dispersed by the wind, and smell becomes unreliable as a long-range sense. What matters in the air is vision in the vestibular sense, the ability to see the landscape, and to sense the body's own orientation and movement. The vision of Quetzalcoatlus was, most certainly, its most important sense. The eyes were large relative to the skull, positioned to provide a wide field of view, and the optic lobes, the brain regions processing visual information, were well developed. An animal that navigates by reading the landscape from altitude, that detects prey from hundreds of meters above the ground, that rides thermals identified visually by the shimmer of warm air and the behavior of smaller birds, that animal needs excellent vision. Quetzalcoatlus could see, sharply, over long distances, with the clarity of an apex flying predator that depends on visual acuity for its survival. The question of whether Quetzalcoatlus was warm-blooded, whether it was a metabolically active endotherm like a modern bird or a cold-blooded ectotherm like a modern reptile, has been debated for decades and has been resolved, in the last 30 years firmly in favor of endothermy. The evidence comes from multiple sources. The bone histology of therosaurs, the growth rings and bone tissue type, is consistent with the rapid, continuous growth characteristic of warm-blooded animals. The presence of pycnofibers, the hair-like integumentary structures found in many pterosaurs, indicates a covering analogous to the fur of mammals, which in modern animals serves primarily as thermal insulation. You do not need thermal insulation if you are cold-blooded. The flight mechanics are also relevant. Powered flight is energetically expensive, more expensive per unit time than almost any other form of locomotion. A cold-blooded animal with a metabolic rate too low to sustain the oxygen delivery demands of continuous powered flight could not have flown in the way that pterosaurs flew. The physics require a warm-blooded animal. Quetzalcoatlus was warm-blooded. It maintained a constant body temperature. It had a high metabolic rate. It was, in the physiological sense that matters, much more like a modern bird than like a modern lizard, despite being neither. This warm-bloodedness had implications beyond simply enabling flight. It meant that Quetzalcoatlus was active in cool conditions as well as warm ones. It meant that it could fly at high altitude, where temperatures dropped significantly. It meant that it could be active at night, if necessary, rather than being limited to the warmest hours of the day. A warm-blooded flying animal of this size was a formidable organism, metabolically capable, behaviorally flexible, able to operate across a range of conditions that would have grounded a cold-blooded alternative. The pycnofibers of pterosaurs, the hair-like or filament-like structures that covered at least some pterosaurs, and quite possibly all of them, deserve more than a brief mention, because they are one of the most remarkable discoveries in the history of pterosaur research. Pycnofibers were first documented in the 1970s in specimens of the small pterosaur. Swords pilosus from Kazakhstan, a species whose name literally means hairy devil, reflecting the presence of the fuzzy integumentary covering visible in the fossil. Since then, pycnofibers have been documented in multiple pterosaur species from diverse geological formations. In 2019, a study of a beautifully preserved specimen of the Pterosaur tapacurara from Brazil revealed that the pycnofibers were not simple hair-like filaments, as previously assumed, but were complex, branching structures more similar to the downy feathers of modern birds than to the simple hair of mammals. The structural similarity to feathers raised the possibility that pycnofibers and feathers share a common evolutionary origin, that both were derived from a single type of integumentary structure present in the common ancestor of pterosaurs and dinosaurs. This is a profound and still debated implication. If true, it means that feathers in a protoform are older than we thought, that the integumentary innovation that eventually produced the plumage of modern birds has a history extending back before the divergence of the pterosaur and dinosaur lineages to a common ancestor in the Triassic. For Quetzalcoatlus, this means that the animal was almost certainly covered in pycnofibers, the fuzzy, insulating covering that served as the pterosaur equivalent of fur or down, not the smooth-skinned, naked pterosaur of older reconstructions. A fuzzy, insulated, warm-blooded flyer, more like a giant, toothless, crest-headed bird than like anything we would call a reptile. The color of Quetzalcoatlus is unknown, as it is for most therosaurs whose soft tissue does not typically preserve the melanosomes that allow color reconstruction in some feathered dinosaurs. What we can do is reason about it, using the same logic we have applied to other extinct animals in this series. Quetzalcoatlus had a crest, a prominent visual display structure. Display structures are almost universally colorful in modern animals because the entire point of a display structure is to be seen, and visibility requires contrast, which requires color. The crest of Quetzalcoatlus was almost certainly not uniformly gray or brown. It was almost certainly, at least in part, vividly colored, reds, oranges, yellows, blues, or combinations thereof, in patterns that communicated identity, sex, and reproductive status to other Quetzalcoatlus individuals. The body covering, the technophyplas, may have been more cryptically colored, providing some degree of camouflage when the animal was on the ground. Many modern large birds are cryptically colored on the body, but display vivid colors on the face, the bill, or specialized display structures. A similar pattern, cryptic body, vivid crest, would make biological sense for Quetzalcoatlus. The wing membrane may have been translucent or semi-translucent in thin areas. The membrane was very thin, and in strongly lit conditions, light may have shone through it, creating a distinctive visual E-yoked when a Quetzalcoatlus was seen against the sky. These are inferences, not certainties, but they are informed inferences, grounded in the biology of related modern animals and in the functional logic of the anatomical structures we can observe in the fossil material. The Quetzalcoatlus of accurate reconstruction was not the gray, leathery, bat-winged creature of old museum models. It was colorful, fuzzy, and in the right light, at the right angle, beautiful. The family to which Quetzalcoatlus belongs, the Asdarchidae, was one of the most diverse and successful pterosaur families of the late Cretaceous, and exploring the wider Asdarchid family gives us a richer understanding of the ecological range and the evolutionary variety of this remarkable group. Asdarchids were defined by their long necks, long and toothless beaks, and large body sizes. The family includes some of the largest pterosaurs known, and the terrestrial stalker feeding strategy appears to have been characteristic of the group as a whole. In Romania, specifically in the late Cretaceous deposits of the Hatic Basin, a fascinating Asdarchid called Hexagopteryx thambima was found. The fragmentary material from Hexagopteryx is striking for its robustness. The bones are much more heavily built than those of Quetzalcoatlus, suggesting an animal of comparable wingspan but substantially greater mass, and crucially, a much more powerfully built skull and neck. Hexagopteryx was, in the reconstruction that has emerged from recent research, not a gracile long-distance sauropod like Quetzalcoatlus, but a massively built predator with a short, robust neck and a proportionally enormous, heavily reinforced skull. Endurance in skull robustness between Hexagopteryx and Quetzalcoatlus is comparable to the endurance between a tiger's skull and a giraffe's. The two animals are clearly diurate functional types, not merely size variants of the same body plan. This diurance has ecological significance. The Hatic Basin of late Cretaceous. Romania was an island ecosystem. The region was surrounded by the warm Tethys. Sea separated from the European mainland. Island ecosystems frequently produce ecological oddities. Prey animals that have dwarfed in the absence of large predators, or predators that have evolved to fill niches normally occupied by animals of diurine body plans. In the Hatic Basin, the large dinosaurian herbivores were island dwarfs. Megarosaurus, a dwarf sauropod the size of a horse, and the apex predator. Hexagopteryx was a pterosaur with a robust skull, adapted for dealing with prey considerably larger than the insects and small vertebrates that Quetzalcoatlus apparently preferred. Hexagopteryx may have been the apex predator of the Haiti island ecosystem, not a soaring long-distance flyer, a heavy, powerful, short-range aerial predator that used its immense, robust skull to overpower prey animals far larger than the small vertebrates available to mainland Asdarchids. Two Asdarchids, same family, completely diurent ecological strategies. The evolutionary flexibility of the group was extraordinary. There is one more Asdarchid worth mentioning specifically, not because it was the largest or the most dramatic, but because its discovery significantly expanded our understanding of how widely the Asdarchid family was distributed across the late Cretaceous world. Arambergenia philadelphiae was named from fragmentary material found in Jordan, a single, enormous neck vertebra discovered in 1943 and initially misidentified before being correctly placed within the Asdarchid family in the 1990s. The vertebra from Jordan is extraordinary. It is nearly 78 centimeters long, a single neck bone, nearly as long as a human torso. Based on scaling from this element and comparison with more complete asdarchids, Arembergenia was estimated to have had a wingspan potentially comparable to Quetzalcoatlus, perhaps 10 meters or more. The discovery of a giant asdarchid in Jordan confirmed that animals of this scale were not restricted to North America. The large asdarchids were global, distributed across the landmasses of the late Cretaceous world, from North America to Europe to the Middle East. They were cosmopolitan animals, probably capable of crossing the broad, shallow seas that separated the late Cretaceous landmasses on their remarkable long-range flights. A world with Quetzalcoatlus in Texas, Hatzegopteryx in Romania, Arembergenia in Jordan, similar animals of extraordinary size on multiple continents simultaneously. The skies of the late Cretaceous were not empty. They were crossed, regularly and repeatedly, by some of the largest flying animals in the history of life. The extinction of Quetzalcoatlus, the end of the asdarchids, and of the therosaurs as a whole, was part of the great KPG extinction event that ended the age of the non-avian dinosaurs. The asteroid that struck Chicxulub 66 million years ago killed not just the terrestrial megafauna of the late Cretaceous, but devastated the aerial fauna as well. The therosaurs, for all their extraordinary capabilities, were no more immune to the global ecological collapse that followed the impact than any other large animal. The specific mechanisms by which therosaurs were driven to extinction are not entirely clear. The immediate yuyuks of the impact, the blast, the fires, the impact winter, would have killed many individuals directly, but the longer-term yuyuks, the collapse of the food chains that sustained therosaurs, whether terrestrial prey for the stalking asdarchids or marine prey for other therosaur groups, were probably the ultimate cause of the lineage's extinction. Therosaurs that fed on terrestrial prey, like Quetzalcoatlus, were dependent on the same ecosystem that collapsed for the dinosaurs. As the plant communities died in the impact winter, the small vertebrates that Quetzalcoatlus hunted declined. Without prey, the pterosaur could not sustain itself. Pterosaurs that fed on marine prey were dependent on marine food chains that were themselves severely disrupted. The collapse of marine primary productivity that we discussed in the mosasaur episode ayuked the fish populations that many pterosaurs fed on. There was no refuge, there was no food source that escaped the impact of the KPG event broadly enough to sustain a population of large pterosaurs through the extinction bottleneck. The therosaurs died, all of them. The last asdarchid, wherever it was soaring over some late Cretaceous landscape, riding the thermals above a world that was already slowly dying, was the last of 150 million years of therosaur history. And the sky, after 66 million years ago, belonged to the birds. The birds that survived the KPG extinction were small seed-eaters and ground foragers that could subsist on resources that persisted through the impact winter. They were not the spectacular soaring birds of the modern sky. They were the ancestors, modest, cautious, surviving in the margins of a devastated world. But from those survivors, in the tens of millions of years that followed, the extraordinary diversity of modern birds evolved. The condors and albatrosses that are the largest flying birds today, still far smaller than Quetzalcoatlus, but the largest that the post-extinction world has produced. The eagles and falcons and hawks that fill the predatory niches that pterosaurs once occupied. The frigate birds and pelicans and boobies that exploit the marine niches that pterosaurs of other lineages once dominated. The birds are the survivors of the great aerial lineage, not the therosaurs, the birds, a diurent evolutionary branch of the archosaur tree, shaped by 66 million years of evolution in a world without therosaurs. And in the largest of those birds, in the Andean condor circling the thermals above the Andes, in the wandering albatross spanning 3.5 meters of southern ocean sky, in the harpy eagle gripping a rainforest branch on feet as large as a human hand, something of what Quetzalcoatlus was persists. Not in the genes, which are irretrievably separated by 66 million years of independent evolution, but in the ecology, in the physics of soaring flight, in the reading of thermals and the exploitation of updrafts, and the long, efficient, unhurried crossing of vast distances on wings that generate lift from the same atmosphere, on the same planet, under the same sun. The sky has changed, the animals in it have changed, but the sky is the same sky. And the principles that let Quetzalcoatlus fly, the same principles of aerodynamics and thermals and soaring efficiency, still govern everything that flies in it today. The most recent scientific work on Quetzalcoatlus, the landmark 2021 papers by Brian Andres, Kevin Hartman, and their colleagues, represented the most significant advance in our understanding of the animal since Lawson's original 1975 description. The 2021 papers provided the first full systematic description of both Cuniothropy and Cunosoni, including detailed anatomical descriptions of every known element, rigorous phylogenetic analysis, revised size estimates, and a comprehensive reconstruction of the animal's ecology and behavior. Among the key findings, the formal recognition of Q. lawsoni as a distinct species from Q. noctropi based on anatomical diurgences that had been noted but not formally codified in earlier work. The revised mass estimate for Q. Northropy, placing the most likely weight at approximately 200 to 250 kilograms for the giant species, and the detailed reconstruction of the terrestrial stalking behavior based on analysis of limb proportions and jaw mechanics that confirmed and expanded earlier work pointing in this direction. The 2021 papers also highlighted how much we still do not know. The skull of Q. northropy remains reconstructed primarily by inference from Q. lawsoni and from other asdarchids. The soft tissue anatomy, the pecnofibers, the wing membrane, the color is inferred rather than directly observed. The growth stages, the reproductive biology, the social behavior, the precise details of how these animals navigated and oriented during long-distance flights, all of these remain areas of active research and genuine uncertainty. The work is ongoing, the questions are still being asked, and every new specimen from every new locality has the potential to change or refine or overthrow what we currently think we know. That is what science is, and the science of Quetzalcoatlus is very much alive. Let us end where we began, in the air. Imagine the late Cretaceous sky one final time, the same sky we opened with, the same warmth, the same humidity, the same depth of blue. And in that sky, high above the landscape, a Quetzalcoatlus in soaring flight. It has been airborne for 6 hours. It took Letter 1B0 from a floodplain in what is now Texas, spiraling upward in a thermal until it reached its cruising altitude, then gliding northwest in the direction its navigation, whatever form that navigation takes, is directing it, toward a river system it has visited before, toward a concentration of nesting dinosaurs whose hatchlings will provide, when it descends, a productive hunting ground. It does not think about any of this. It does not plan. It does not anticipate. It navigates by the accumulated instinct of millions of years of evolution, by the sensory information of the moment, by the deep programming of a brain built for exactly this, for reading the sky, for finding the thermals, for arriving, eventually, at the right place. The wingspan catches the light, 10½ meters, taut against the wind. The crest catches the light too vivid against the blue of the late Cretaceous sky, a signal that means Quetzalcoatlus to any Quetzalcoatlus that sees it. It does not know that 66 million years from now, a creature that does not yet exist will find its bones in Texas and spend decades trying to understand what it was. It does not know anything in the way that we know things. It simply is. It simply flies. It simply does what has been shaped by every generation of its lineage going back to the first pterosaur that ever left the ground to do. The largest flying animal in the history of life on Earth, riding the thermals of the late Cretaceous afternoon. Magnificent, real, gone. unknown, finally, imperfectly, with all the humility that knowing something truly ancient requires by us. There was 100 facts about Quetzalcoatlus northropi, the feathered serpent of the late Cretaceous sky, the largest flying animal that has ever lived, the terrestrial storker and long-distance soarer, the Azdrachic pterosaur of Big Bend, Texas, whose bones Douglas Lawson found eroding out of the Javelina Formation in 1971, and whose story we are still, half a century later, learning to read completely. 100 facts, and the animal is still larger than all of them. The next episode is already waiting, a new prehistoric creature, a new 100 facts, a new chapter in the extraordinary story of life on this planet. Leave your favorite fact in the comments. Leave the image that stays with you, the vault Takeo letter 1B0, the thermal soaring, the long neck sweeping across the Cretaceous ground, the wingspan catching the afternoon light. Every fact was real, every moment of it happened. This has been Sleepy Dino. Good night. There is a detail about the way Quetzalcoatlus held its neck in flight that took researchers a surprisingly long time to work out, and that changed, in a fundamental way, how we visualize this animal in the air. For years, the default reconstruction showed Quetzalcoatlus in flight, with its neck hanging downward, draping below the body in a swan-like curve, with the head dangling toward the ground. It was an intuitive reconstruction. A long neck, unsupported, would presumably hang under gravity. But detailed analysis of the neck vertebrae and their articulation surfaces tells a diurent story. The joint geometry of the Quetzalcoatlus neck indicates that the natural resting position of the neck, the position it would adopt without muscular E-urt, was not hanging downward, but extended forward and slightly upward, roughly parallel to the long axis of the body. This posture makes aerodynamic sense. A neck hanging below the body creates drag. A neck extended forward along the body's axis reduces drag and contributes to the streamlined profile that efficient long-distance soaring requires. The aerodynamic logic and the anatomical logic point in the same direction. Neck forward, head at the front of the animal, the entire body forming a roughly horizontal profile in flight. The image changes completely, not a drooping neck and a dangling head, but a forward-thrust arrow, the long skull at the front, the neck extending back to the body, the wings spanning outward from the shoulders, the hind limbs tucked back along the tail. An integrated aerodynamic shape, not a collection of awkwardly hanging appendages. Quetzalcoatlus in flight was not ungainly, it was streamlined. It was, in the aerodynamic sense, well designed, and the neck that seemed so problematically long on the ground was, in the air, part of what made the animal work as a flying machine. The relationship between Quetzalcoatlus and the other animals of its late Cretaceous landscape is more complex and more interesting than a simple coexistence narrative would suggest. In the Javelina Formation of Big Bend, the geological unit that has yielded the Quetzalcoatlus material, the fossil fauna includes a diverse community of late Cretaceous animals, large hadrosaurs including Cretaceous, the ceratopsian Brachioceratops, small theropod dinosaurs, various turtles, lizards, and crocodilians. And the mosasaur prognathodon has been found in nearby formations, suggesting that the ancient waterways of the region were home to large aquatic predators as well. In this community, Quetzalcoatlus northropi occupied a unique position, the only animal capable of flight at this scale, and therefore the only animal capable of the kind of long-range, landscape-level foraging that its ecology appears to have required. The smaller species, Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, shared the same landscape. With a wingspan of 5 to 6 meters and a correspondingly smaller body mass, Q. lawsoni was capable of accessing diurnal prey sizes and potentially diurnal microhabitats than the giant northropi. The coexistence of two species of the same genus in the same formation implies ecological separation. The small species and the giant species were not competing directly because they were not the same size and therefore not taking the same prey. This size-based ecological partitioning is seen frequently in modern communities of closely related predators. In Africa, the African fish eagle and the martial eagle are both large eagles that share the same broad habitat, but their diurent sizes and diurent prey preferences allow them to coexist without significant competitive overlap. Cunarthropy and Cursoni may have worked the same way. Diurent sizes, diurent prey, diurent flight characteristics, the same landscape. The giant hunting juvenile dinosaurs and large lizards, the merely large hunting smaller vertebrates and insects, each exploiting the late Cretaceous floodplain of Texas at a diurent scale. The question of how Quetzalcoatlus interacted with the large theropod dinosaurs of its time, particularly T-Rex, which inhabited the same formation and the same geological moment, is one that generates considerable interest and very little direct fossil evidence. The honest answer is, we do not know. T-Rex was capable, in principle, of killing a Quetzalcoatlus. A 2-ton tyrannosaur with a bite force of 35,000 newtons could certainly deal with a pterosaur whose hollow bones were designed for minimum weight rather than resistance to crushing force. But whether T-Rex actually preyed on Quetzalcoatlus, whether encounters between the two species were predatory rather than simply spatial, is not established. The flight capability of Quetzalcoatlus was its primary defense. A T-Rex cannot fly. It cannot chase a pterosaur that is taken to the air, and the volt-takio letter 1B0 of Quetzalcoatlus, from standing to airborne in a fraction of a second, would have been sui sent to escape any terrestrial predator that was not already within striking distance. The real risk to Quetzalcoatlus from T-Rex was during the period of ground-based activity. A pterosaur walking slowly through low vegetation, head down, focused on detecting small prey, was not paying full attention to its surroundings. A T-Rex in ambush position and tyrannosaurs were, at least in part, ambush predators, could potentially close the distance before the pterosaur detected it and launched. Whether this happened regularly or occasionally or never, the fossil record does not tell us. We have no Quetzalcoatlus bones with T-Rex bite marks. We have no T-Rex with Quetzalcoatlus bone fragments in its stomach region. The two animals coexisted in the same landscape. What happened when they met is, for now, a mystery. The evolution of giant size in therosaurs, the process by which small, agile Triassic flyers became the colossal ashdarchids of the late Cretaceous, is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of vertebrate evolution. The earliest pterosaurs, from the late Triassic period roughly 220 to 230 million years ago, were small animals. Most had wingspans of less than a meter, and their anatomy was that of agile, perhaps tree-dwelling creatures that glided or flew in ways more analogous to modern small bats than to the soaring giants of the late Cretaceous. The evolutionary origin of pterosaurs is remarkably still not fully resolved. Unlike the dinosaurs, whose ancestry within the broader Archosaur tree is well understood, the specific evolutionary lineage that gave rise to the first therosaur remains unclear. No convincing transitional fossil between non-flying archosaurs and the earliest therosaurs has been found. The first therosaurs appear in the fossil record already capable of flight, with fully formed wings, pneumatized bones, and the structural modifications needed for aerial life. This gap, the absence of a transitional form between ground-dwelling archosaur and flying therosaur, is one of paleontology's most prominent open questions. Where did the therosaur wing come from? What was the intermediate stage between a terrestrial archosaur and a creature capable of powered flight? Various hypotheses have been proposed: that pterosaurs evolved flight from the trees down, gliding before they could power fly; that they evolved from the ground up, running and leaping; that they evolved from small Cly letter 1B0 dwelling animals that launched themselves into the air from elevated positions. None of these hypotheses has been confirmed by the fossil record, because the fossil record of very early therosaurs is sparse and fragmentary. The mystery of pterosaur origins is the mystery of flight's first steps, and it remains, despite 200 years of paleontological research, genuinely unsolved. From those mysterious small beginnings in the Triassic, the therosaurs diversified into an extraordinary variety of forms across the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. The earliest therosaurs, the rhamphorhynchanes, had long tails that served as flight stabilizers, a feature retained through the Triassic and Jurassic, but lost in the more derived therosaurs of the Cretaceous. The Jurassic saw the emergence of the therodactyloids, the short-tailed pterosaurs that include the lineages leading to the Astardids, and these short-tailed forms were generally more aerodynamically capable than their long-tailed predecessors. The Cretaceous was the age of therosaur gigantism. As the period progressed, the maximum size achieved by pterosaurs increased steadily, from the modestly large pterosaurs of the early Cretaceous to the extreme sizes represented by Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives in the late Cretaceous. The drivers of this size increase are not entirely clear. Competition with early birds, which diversified rapidly in the Cretaceous and may have displaced therosaurs from some smaller body-sized niches, is one proposed factor. The availability of large prey on the expanding late Cretaceous landmasses is another. The specific aerodynamic advantages of very large wingspan for long-distance soaring, which improves disproportionately with increasing size up to the physical limit, may have created a selection pressure toward larger body size in lineages that relied on this flight style. Whatever the drivers, the trend was unmistakable. The late Cretaceous sky belonged to giants, and Quetzalcoatlus was the largest of all of them. There is a comparison that is sometimes made between Quetzalcoatlus and a giraffe, and it is a comparison worth exploring because it illuminates something specific and striking about the proportions of the giant pterosaur. A large adult male giraffe stands approximately 5.5 to 6 meters tall, with a neck of approximately 2.5 meters. When a giraffe stands at full height, its head is roughly at the level of a 2-story building. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, standing on the ground, was comparable in height to a large giraffe, perhaps 5 to 6 meters from foot to the top of the crest, depending on how the neck was held. Its neck, at approximately 2.5 to 3 meters in the giant species, was comparable in length to a giraffe's neck. But there the resemblance ends. A giraffe weighs approximately 800 to 1,200 kilograms. Quetzalcoatlus weighed approximately 200 to 250 kilograms, an animal of giraffe height at 1/5 of giraffe weight. The extreme lightness is what makes this comparison so striking. At giraffe height, and with a giraffe-length neck, Quetzalcoatlus weighed no more than 2 or 3 large humans. The weight had been stripped away so completely by the pneumatized bones, by the absence of heavy mineralized teeth, by the fine-walled hollow wing bones, by the lean, eucent musculature of an animal shaped by every generation of its lineage for minimum mass, that the result was something that barely seems physically possible. A giraffe-sized animal that weighed less than a large motorcycle, a neck as long as a giraffe's on a body light enough to fly. The engineering is breathtaking, and it is all the more breathtaking because it was not engineered at all. It was evolved, produced by the blind, patient, mathematical process of natural selection operating on random variation across millions of generations. No engineer, no matter how brilliant, could have designed this from first principles. Evolution not there anyway. The wing membrane of Quetzalcoatlus, the pterygium, was not a simple sheet of skin stretched over the wing bones. It was a complex, functionally sophisticated tissue with an internal structure more like a biological composite material than like ordinary skin. Research on the wing membranes of well-preserved pterosaur specimens, not from Quetzalcoatlus directly, whose wing membrane has not been preserved, but from smaller pterosaurs in Jurassic and early Cretaceous lagistatin deposits that preserve soft tissue, has revealed a layered internal structure. Within the wing membrane, embedded in the tissue, were 2 distinctive elements. First, actinophobos, style letter 1b0, rod-like fibers arranged in a specific pattern across the membrane, like the structural reinforcement in a composite material. These fibers appear to have stylu in the membrane selectively, controlling its shape under aerodynamic loads, without making it entirely rigid. Second, a layer of muscle fibers running spanwise along the membrane muscles that could actively contract and relax, adjusting the tension and camber of the membrane in real time during flight. The wing was not a passive aerodynamic surface. It was an active one, capable of continuous, precise shape control in response to changing aerodynamic conditions. This active wing control gave pterosaurs a degree of flight precision that passive wings, like those of many insects, whose wings are purely structural rather than muscular, cannot achieve. In turbulent conditions, in tight maneuvering, in the precise adjustments needed to ride the edge of a thermal without drifting out of the rising air column, the ability to actively shape the wing membrane was a significant advantage. Quetzalcoatlus' wings were not sails. They were active control surfaces, dynamic, responsive, continuously managed by a nervous system tuned over millions of years for exactly this purpose. The inner ear of pterosaurs, studied through CT scanning of fossilized skulls, provides some of the most direct evidence we have about the sensory and motor capabilities of these animals. The semicircular canals of the inner ear, the structures responsible for detecting rotational motion and maintaining balance, are among the most revealing elements of the pterosaur endocast. In Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives, the semicircular canals are very large, particularly the anterior and posterior canals that detect rotational motion in the vertical plane, the plane in which pitch changes occur during flight. This large canal size is consistent with high sensitivity to pitch changes, the forward and backward rotations of the head that occur constantly during flight as the animal adjusts its attitude. An animal that is sensitive to small pitch changes can respond more quickly to disturbances in its flight attitude, gusts of wind, thermal turbulence, the aerodynamic E-yokes of a prey strike, and can maintain stable, controlled flight more effectively in challenging conditions. The vestibular system of Quetzalcoatlus was, in short, tuned for flight, tuned for the specific kinds of rotational disturbances that large wingspan soaring flight produces, tuned for rapid, precise responses to the aerodynamic challenges of moving through the air at altitude. There is something almost musical about this, an instrument tuned to a specific frequency, resonant in exactly the range where it needs to be resonant, silent in the ranges that do not matter. The inner ear of Quetzalcoatlus was tuned to the frequency of flight. The fossil record of Quetzalcoatlus and the Azhdarchids is, by the standards of the dinosaur fossil record, frustratingly sparse. The giant species, Cunothrop, is known primarily from the fragmentary material. Lawson collected in 1971 wing bones, some vertebral material, and from a small number of additional fragments found in subsequent years of fieldwork at Big Bend. No complete skull of Cunothrop has ever been found, no complete neck, no complete wing with all elements articulated. The reconstruction of Cunothrop is necessarily heavily dependent on scaling from the better-known smaller species and from other, more completely known Azhdarchids. Culersoni is better known, with more complete material that includes partial skull elements, better preserved vertebrae, and more complete limb material. But even Culersoni is not known from anything close to a complete skeleton. Why is the fossil record of Azhdarchids so poor, given their apparent abundance and global distribution? The answer lies in part in the taphonomy of large flying animals. Therosaurs died in environments where preservation was generally de-euclid. Their light, hollow bones were fragile, easily crushed, easily destroyed by scavengers, easily dispersed by wind and water. Large therosaurs that died on open floodplains, the terrestrial stalking environment of the Azhdarchids, were exposed to the full range of taphonomic destruction: scavenging, weathering, transport by rivers, physical abrasion. The conditions that preserve fossils best, rapid burial in fine-grained sediment, anoxic conditions at depth, chemical environments favorable to mineralization, were less available to animals that lived on open ground than to animals that lived near or in water. We find so many fish and marine reptile fossils because fish and marine reptiles died near or in water, in environments where preservation was possible. We find relatively few Azhdarchid fossils because Azhdarchids died on land, in environments where preservation was de-euclid. The giants of the late Cretaceous sky are underrepresented in the fossil record precisely because they lived in the place, the open Cretaceous landscape, that the geological record preserves least well. The question of how many Quetzalcoatlus individuals existed, the population size of the species, is one that cannot be answered directly from the fossil record, but that can be approached through ecological modeling. A large flying predator with the ecology of Quetzalcoatlus requires a large territory to sustain itself, based on the prey available on late Cretaceous floodplains and the metabolic requirements of a warm-blooded animal of 200 to 250 kilograms. Estimates of territory size for Q-Neothropy have ranged from hundreds to thousands of square kilometers per individual. At the lower end of that range, say 500 square kilometers per individual, the total area of the late Cretaceous habitats available to Q-Neothropy in North America might have sustained a few thousand individuals. At the higher end, the population might have been much smaller, in the hundreds. This is a rough calculation with enormous uncertainty, but it points toward the conclusion that Q-Neothropy was, even in its prime, a relatively rare animal, not the kind of species that formed flocks or herds or large congregations. More likely a largely solitary predator, widely dispersed across the landscape, encountering other members of its species relatively infrequently. Rare even when alive, almost impossible to find after death. The fossil record is not simply sparse because preservation was poor. It may be sparse, in part, because there were never that many Q-Neothropy individuals to preserve. There is a human story embedded in the science of Quetzalcoatlus, the story of the people who have spent their careers studying these fragmentary, de-euclid, extraordinary fossils, and it deserves a moment of its own. Douglas Lawson, who found the original material in 1971, was a graduate student in his 20s. The discovery that he made walking across the Badlands of Big Bend, recognizing the significance of a bone eroding out of the rock, launched a career in geology and paleontology and established his place permanently in the history of the science. One Langston Jr., who supervised Lawson and who spent decades working on the Quetzalcoatl's material after the original discovery, was one of the foremost vertebrate paleontologists of the 20th century. His patient, meticulous work on the fragmentary Texas material, in preparing specimens, describing elements, placing them in the context of pterosaur evolution, was the foundation on which all subsequent Quetzalcoatlus research has been built. Brian Andreas, whose 2021 papers provided the first comprehensive systematic treatment of Quetzalcoatlus in nearly 5 decades, worked on this material for years, building on Langston's unpublished notes and observations, conducting new CT scanning and surface analysis, collaborating with specialists in aerodynamics and biomechanics to produce the most complete picture of the animal yet assembled. And Kevin Hartman, the scientific illustrator whose reconstructions of Quetzalcoatlus, informed by the 2021 research, have been among the most accurate and most widely reproduced images of the animal, has contributed to the public understanding of Quetzalcoatlus in ways that no scientific paper alone can achieve. Science is not done by individuals in isolation. It is done by communities of researchers building on each other's work, challenging each other's assumptions, contributing diurent skills and perspectives to the shared project of understanding something ancient and de-euclid and extraordinary. Quetzalcoatlus has been understood by a community, and the understanding that community has produced across 50 years of collective EUOT is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of paleontology. Let us talk about something that almost never gets discussed in popular accounts of Quetzalcoatlus, the question of how this animal drank water. A warm-blooded animal of 200 kilograms has significant water requirements. The metabolic processes of a mesotherm generate heat that must be dissipated, and in a large, active animal, water loss, through respiration and thermoregulation, is substantial. Quetzalcoatlus needed to drink regularly, probably every day, or at most every few days, to maintain its water balance. How did it drink? The long neck and the toothless beak were adapted for terrestrial hunting, not for dipping into water. A long-necked animal drinking from a shallow river or pool faces a specific mechanical challenge. The neck must reach down to the water surface, which places significant demands on the neck musculature, and the skull must be positioned correctly to allow water to flow into the mouth. For modern long-necked animals, this challenge is solved in diurent ways. Giraffes drink by spreading their forelegs widely and lowering the head to water level, an awkward posture that leaves them temporarily vulnerable to predators. Long-necked birds like herons and flamingos drink by simply dipping the beak into shallow water, their neck proportions allowing this without difficulty. Quetzalcoatlus, with its proportions and its body plan, probably drank by wading into shallow water or by landing near the edge of a water source and positioning itself to reach the water surface with the beak tip. The long neck, held roughly horizontally in the feeding position, could be directed downward by the appropriate neck musculature to reach a water surface a meter or more below the body. It would have been an interesting sight, the largest flying animal in the history of life, standing at the edge of a Cretaceous river, drinking, vulnerable in a way that it almost never was in the air, present in a way that left traces, footprints in the riverside mud that in some cases survived to become fossils. The water brought Quetzalcoatlus down from the sky, regularly and necessarily, and in coming down, it entered a world where the ground predators, the T-rexers, and the large theropods had at least a theoretical opportunity. The relationship between Quetzalcoatlus and the atmospheric conditions of the late Cretaceous world is one that deserves specific attention, because the atmosphere of the late Cretaceous was subtly diurent from the modern atmosphere, and those diurences may have had significant implications for large pterosaur flight. The late Cretaceous atmosphere had a somewhat higher oxygen content than the modern atmosphere, perhaps 30% oxygen by volume compared to the modern 21%. Higher atmospheric oxygen means denser air at any given pressure, and denser air generates more lift per unit of wing area at any given speed. For Quetzalcoatlus, a denser atmosphere meant that the aerodynamic forces on its wings were somewhat greater than they would be in the modern atmosphere. This would have made flight slightly easier, requiring somewhat less speed to generate the lift needed to stay airborne, or allowing the same speed to carry a slightly heavier animal. Some researchers have argued that the higher oxygen content of the late Cretaceous atmosphere was a prerequisite for the evolution of giant pterosaurs, that the physical limit on flying animal size was higher in the denser Cretaceous atmosphere than it would be today, and that Quetzalcoatlus represents an animal that was optimized for a world that no longer exists. The implication is interesting. If Quetzalcoatlus were transporting to the modern atmosphere with its lower oxygen content and therefore its lower air density, it might struggle to maintain flight. The margins of aerodynamic feasibility that allowed it to fly in the late Cretaceous might not exist in the modern world. We cannot test this, but the possibility is worth holding, that the largest flying animal in the history of life was calibrated not just to its ecological world, but to its atmospheric world, that the very air it flew through was part of what made it possible. The discovery site of Quetzalcoatlus in Big Bend National Park in southwest Texas is itself a place of extraordinary geological significance, and understanding the landscape that produced the fossil helps us understand the animal. Big Bend sits at the confluence of three major geological provinces of the American. Southwest, the Basin and Range, the Rio Grande Rift, and the Chihuahuan Desert. The landscape is dramatic, deep canyons, volcanic peaks, ancient river terraces, and the exposed rock spans a remarkable range of geological ages, from Cretaceous sedimentary rock in the northern part of the park to tertiary volcanic rock in the south. The Javelina Formation, where the Quetzalcoatlus material was found, outcrops in the northern part of the park, in areas of low, eroded badlands similar to the chalk badlands of Kansas. The rock is a mix of mudstones, siltstones, and sandstones, fluvial sediments laid down on the floodplains and river channels of the late Cretaceous landscape. Today, Big Bend is a desert, hot, dry, sparsely vegetated, dramatic in its barrenness. In the late Cretaceous, it was the opposite. Warm, humid, covered in dense floodplain vegetation, crossed by braided rivers carrying sediment from the rising Rocky Mountains to the west. The same ground that is now sun-baked desert caliche was once the muddy floor of a Cretaceous floodplain where hadrosaurs grazed, small mammals burrowed, and Quetzalcoatlus walked on its four-folded limbs looking for food. The transformation of the landscape across 68 million years is one of the most vivid illustrations of geological time available. Stand in the badlands of Big Bend, look at the white and gray rock eroding into the desert air, and know that the rock beneath your feet was once the living, breathing floor of a Cretaceous world. The fossil it holds, the wing bone, the neck vertebra, the fragment of skull, is the record of that world, still there. Still real, still waiting, in some cases, to be found. Let us revisit the size question one final time, not to rehash the numbers, but to sit with what those numbers mean in a deeper sense. The largest confirmed wingspan of Quetzalcoatlus northropi, 10 to 11 meters, the weight 200 to 250 kilograms, the height on the ground 5 to 6 meters. These numbers place Quetzalcoatlus in a category that has no living parallel. There is nothing alive today that is simultaneously this large and capable of flight. The wandering albatross had 3.5 meters of wingspan and 8 to 10 kilograms of weight, is the largest flying bird. The condors, at 3 meters and 12 kilograms, are the heaviest. The largest bat, the giant golden-crowned flying fox of the Philippines, has a wingspan of approximately 1.7 meters. None of these animals is remotely comparable to Quetzalcoatlus in absolute size. The gap between the largest modern flying animal and Quetzalcoatlus is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of kind, a diurnal order of magnitude, a flying animal so much larger than anything that currently flies that comparison requires the kind of creative euyet we usually reserve for imagining things that do not exist. But it did exist. This is not mythology or speculation. This is an animal whose bones are in museums, whose flight mechanics have been analyzed in peer-reviewed papers, whose evolutionary history has been traced through millions of years of fossil record. The largest flying animal in the history of life was real. It flew over Texas 68 million years ago, and then it didn't. The sky above Texas today is empty of Quetzalcoatlus, but the rock beneath the desert still holds its traces, and in those traces, in the hollow wing bones and the elongated vertebrae and the fragmentary skull, the animal is still, in the only way available to something this ancient, present. What would it have sounded like? Not the roar of a T-Rex, which is itself speculative, but at least draws on a body plan with vocal structures we can identify and analyze. The sound of a Quetzalcoatlus is even more uncertain. The soft tissue of the throat and the potential vocalization apparatus is entirely unpreserved, and the fossil record gives us no direct evidence of how, or whether, these animals were vocal. What we can say is that the inner ear of Quetzalcoatlus was tuned to detect specific frequencies, and that the frequencies it was most sensitive to were in the low to mid-range, consistent with the sounds produced by large animals at the distances relevant to the open landscape it inhabited. If Quetzalcoatlus was vocal, and there is no strong reason to assume it was not, given the widespread vocalization among modern archosaurs, which includes both birds and crocodilians, its calls were probably in the low-frequency range, deep, resonant, carrying well across the open floodplains and river valleys of the late Cretaceous landscape. The call of Quetzalcoatlus, if we could hear it, would probably not be what we expect. Not the tarantula screech of old movies, that is a modern invention with no scientific basis. More likely something lower, something that resonated in the chest as much as in the ears, something that announced presence and position across a landscape where individuals were widely spaced and encounters were infrequent. We will never hear it, but it was made, somewhere in the late Cretaceous era over Texas. That sound was produced, and it carried across the landscape, and whatever heard it responded in ways that we cannot know. The air carried the sound, the rock did not preserve it, but it was real. The story of how Quetzalcoatlus came to be understood, the intellectual history of the animal, from Lawson's 1975 description to the comprehensive 2021 treatment, is a story about how science accumulates understanding slowly, nonlinearly, and sometimes in unexpected ways. The original 1975 description established the animal and its extraordinary size, but for decades after, the lack of additional material meant that most questions about Quetzalcoatlus' biology, its ecology, its flight mechanics, its growth, its behavior, could only be addressed indirectly through comparison with other ashdodkids and through theoretical modeling. The accumulation of additional ashdodkid material from other sites, particularly the discoveries in the phosphate deposits of Morocco and the chalk of Jordan and the late Cretaceous sediments of Romania, gradually filled in the picture. Each new ashdodkid discovery added to the comparative framework within which Quetzalcoatlus could be interpreted. By 2021, the database of ashdodkid material was rich enough that a comprehensive treatment of Quetzalcoatlus was possible in a way that it had not been in 1975. This is how paleontology often works. The understanding of a specific animal depends not just on the specimens directly attributed to that animal, but on the broader context of related animals and their material. Quetzalcoatlus was understood in 2021 partly through discoveries made in Morocco and Romania that had nothing to do with Texas. The fossil record of the world is interconnected. Each new discovery in each new locality contributes to the context within which all other discoveries are interpreted. The science of Quetzalcoatlus is global because the ashdodkid family was global, and because paleontology is a global endeavor. There is one final image I want to leave you with before we close this episode. It is not a dramatic image, it is a quiet one. It is the image of Douglas Lawson in 1971 walking across the Badlands of Big Bend National Park. He is a graduate student, young, trained in geology, doing the fieldwork that graduate students do. The landscape around him is the high desert of southwest Texas, dry, rocky, eroded into the low ridges and gullies of badland topography. He finds a bone. He does not know yet what he has found. He knows it is unusual, hollow, thin-walled, too large and too light for the dinosaurs he is familiar with. He picks it up. He examines it. He takes it back to the university, where one Langston looks at it and begins to understand. That moment, the moment of recognition, when the bone in the hand becomes the evidence of an extraordinary animal, is one of the defining moments in the history of paleontology. Not because it was dramatic. It was not dramatic. A graduate student found a bone in the Texas desert. He picked it up. That is all. But the bone was the wing bone of the largest flying animal in the history of life. The bone was 50 years of scientific work, still ongoing. The bone was every subsequent analysis, every revised estimate, every comparative study, every aerodynamic model. The bone was the 2021 papers and the museum mounts and the popular reconstructions and this episode. Everything we know about Quetzalcoatlus flows from that moment, from a graduate student picking up a bone in the Texas desert in 1971. Science begins with attention, with the willingness to look at something and ask what it is, with the refusal to walk past the unusual without pausing to consider it. Douglas Lawson paused, he looked, he asked. And in asking, he gave us the thunder lizard of the sky. There was 100 facts about Quetzalcoatlus northropi, the largest flying animal that has ever lived, the feathered serpent of the late Cretaceous sky, named for an Aztec god and found in the Texas desert by a graduate student with a sharp eye and a scientific curiosity that changed what we know about the limits of animal flight. 100 facts about an animal that weighed no more than 2 large humans and flew on wings wider than a small aircraft, that walked the Cretaceous floodplains on 4 limbs, hunting small vertebrates with a precision beak, that soared at 5,000 meters, riding thermals across continents, covering 10,000 kilometers on a single flight, that lived alongside T-Rex and Triceratops and went extinct with them when the asteroid struck 66 million years ago. 100 facts, and the animal is still larger than all of them, still stranger, still, in the deepest sense, beyond what any description fully captures. The sky of the late Cretaceous held things we can barely imagine, and among all of them, the most extraordinary was the one that moved through that sky most silently, most efficiently, most completely at home. The feathered serpent, the thunder of the sky. Quetzalcoatlus. Leave your favorite fact in the comments. Tell us which image stays with you. The vault takeo letter 1B0, the thermal soaring, the long neck sweeping across the Cretaceous ground, or simply the no, 10 meters of wingspan on an animal that weighed 250 kilograms. Every single fact was real. Every moment happened. This has been Sleepy Dino. Good night. Let us talk about something that the popular depictions of Quetzalcoatlus almost always get wrong, and that, when corrected, makes the animal far more interesting than the caricature. In most films, illustrations, and reconstructions that the general public encounters, large therosaurs are shown primarily as aerial animals. They are shown in the air, wings spread, often diving toward the ocean to snatch fish from the surface, or gliding over dramatic prehistoric landscapes in a way that emphasizes their alien, airborne quality. This image is not entirely wrong. Quetzalcoatlus certainly did fly, and certainly did spend significant time in the air, but it misses something crucial about the animal's day-to-day reality. For most of each day, Quetzalcoatlus was on the ground. This is the implication of the terrestrial stork hypothesis, and it is worth dwelling on. An animal that feeds by walking through the landscape, hunting small prey on the ground, is spending the majority of its active hours in terrestrial locomotion and terrestrial hunting. It takes to the air to travel, to move between productive feeding areas, to escape threats, to reach water, but the hunting itself happens on the ground. A Quetzalcoatlus walking through the late Cretaceous floodplain of Texas, head forward on its long neck, moving with its peculiar quadrupedal gait, scanning the ground for movement, was as much a terrestrial animal as an aerial one. It was, in a sense, 2 animals in one body, a terrestrial predator with the ability to transform itself, when it needed to, into a long-distance aerial traveler of extraordinary capability. This duality is one of the most remarkable things about the Azhdarchids. They were not specialized for one mode of life. They had mastered 2 completely different modes of locomotion, ground walking and powered soaring flight, and they used each for different purposes, switching between them as the demands of their ecology required. No modern animal does this at comparable scale. Modern large soaring birds are aerial specialists that are awkward and limited on the ground. Modern large ground animals do not fly. The Azhdarchians occupied a unique position in the history of animal locomotion, truly capable in both the aerial and the terrestrial realm, at a body size that modern evolution has never replicated. The world that Quetzalcoatlus inhabited was, in the final 2 million years before the KPG extinction, a world under increasing stress. The evidence from the latest Cretaceous geological record, rock layers spanning the final few million years before the boundary, suggests that the late Cretaceous world was experiencing significant environmental change even before the asteroid arrived. Volcanic activity in what is now India, the Deccan Traps, one of the largest volcanic provinces in Earth's history, was releasing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, driving climate change and ocean acidification on a global scale. Some researchers have argued that this pre-existing environmental stress had already begun to reduce biodiversity and destabilize ecosystems before the asteroid arrived, that the KPG extinction was a 1-2 punch, with the Deccan volcanism softening the target and the Chicxulub impact delivering the killing blow. Others argue that the evidence for pre-extinction decline is ambiguous and that the ecosystems of the latest Cretaceous were still rich and diverse right up to the moment of impact. For Quetzalcoatlus, the implications of this debate are significant. Was the late Cretaceous world that Cunotropy inhabited already a diminished world, with less prey, less habitat, less ecological stability than the world of its ancestors a few million years earlier? Or was it still a world of full late Cretaceous richness, in which the pterosaur's extraordinary capabilities found full expression? The fossil record from the Javelina Formation does not clearly resolve this question. What it does tell us is that Quetzalcoatlus was present and apparently thriving in the very latest Cretaceous. The material found there is from the final chapter of the Cretaceous, the same chapter that ends with the mass extinction. Right up to the end, the sky held giants. Right up to the end, Quetzalcoatlus flew. There is a broader philosophical point embedded in the story of Quetzalcoatlus that is worth making explicit, a point about the nature of biological possibility and about what the fossil record reveals concerning the range of forms that life can take. Before Quetzalcoatlus was discovered, the theoretical upper limit on flying animal size was considered by many researchers to be substantially smaller than what Quetzalcoatlus turned out to be. The aerodynamic models available in the early 1970s suggested that animals much larger than the largest modern birds would not be able to achieve or sustain powered flight, but the scaling laws of aerodynamics imposed a ceiling on flying animal size that the fossil record had not yet challenged. The discovery of Quetzalcoatlus northropy demolished that theoretical ceiling. Here was a flying animal nearly 4 times the wingspan of the largest modern bird. Here was a flying animal at the scale of a small aircraft. The models had been wrong, or rather, the models had been correct for the parameters fed into them, but those parameters had not included the possibility of an animal as usually built, as mumetized, as precisely calibrated for minimum mass as Quetzalcoatlus. The fossil record is frequently in the business of demolishing theoretical constraints. The paleontological literature is full of discoveries that showed that some biological feat, previously considered impossible or at the very limit of possibility, had in fact been achieved by some extinct animal in some geological period under some combination of ecological conditions. This is one of the deepest lessons of paleontology. The range of biological possibility is larger than we can predict. The constraints we impose on what evolution can produce are regularly violated by what evolution did produce. The natural world, given Sioux-Yucian time and Sioux-Yucian selective pressure, finds ways to do things that our models say cannot be done. Quetzalcoatlus flew, despite the models that said it probably couldn't, despite the theoretical constraints that made flight at its size seem aerodynamically marginal. It flew, efficiently, over thousands of kilometers at altitudes of 5,000 meters for perhaps 20 million years. The fossil record is not merely a record of the past. It is a constant expansion of our understanding of what is possible, and Quetzalcoatlus is one of its most dramatic demonstrations of that truth. Before we close, let us spend a moment with the deep time perspective, with the question of where Quetzalcoatlus sits in the full sweep of the history of flight. Flight evolved multiple times independently in the history of life. Insects achieved it first, approximately 400 million years ago, in the Devonian, and insect flight has been a dominant feature of terrestrial ecosystems ever since. The therosaurs achieved vertebrate-powered flight approximately 230 million years ago in the late Triassic. Birds achieved flight independently through the evolution of feathered wings from the forelimbs of small theropod dinosaurs at approximately 150 million years ago. Bats achieved flight yet again, independently in the early Paleogene, approximately 50 to 60 million years ago. 4 independent origins of powered flight in the history of life, each using a deuterant body plan, a deuterant wing structure, a deuterant set of evolutionary raw materials, each producing a deuterant kind of flying animal with deuterant strengths and deuterant limitations. Of all the flying animals produced by these 4 independent evolutionary experiments, Quetzalcoatlus northropi was the largest, the most extreme, the most aerodynamically ambitious, the animal that pushed the physical limits of what a flying creature can be furthest, and that survived for 20 million years at or near those limits. The 4 independent origins of flight are among the most remarkable stories in evolutionary biology. They tell us that the aerial environment, the 3-dimensional space above the ground, is so ecologically rich, so full of opportunities for animals that can access it, that evolution has found its way there 4 separate times, from 4 separate starting points, in 4 separate geological periods. The sky is an attractor in the space of evolutionary possibility. It calls to organisms capable of reaching it, and the organisms that reach it are, again and again, transformed by the experience of living in 3 dimensions rather than 2. Quetzalcoatlus was the most extreme product of that transformation, the animal that committed to the sky most completely at the largest scale with the most extraordinary biological engineering. And it was real, it flew, it was here. The rock of the Javelina Formation is still eroding. The badlands of Big Bend are still being cut by water and wind, and the daily thermal cycling of the desert. Every year new rock surfaces are exposed. Every year there is the possibility, small but real, that new Quetzalcoatlus material will emerge. A more complete skull, a full neck, a wing with all elements articulated, a juvenile specimen giving us our first clear picture of how this animal looked in its early life. Material that would allow the mass estimates to be refined, the flight models to be updated, the reconstruction of the animal's ecology to be made more specific and more certain. The scientific community has been waiting for this material for 50 years. It may come in the next field season. It may come in 50 more years, or it may never come. The giant species may simply be too rare in the rock, too poorly preserved by the taphonomic conditions of its habitat to ever yield the complete material that researchers need. But the search continues. Every summer, researchers return to Big Bend. They walk the exposures of the Javelina Formation, scanning the rock surface with the trained attention of people who know what they are looking for. They collect the small fragments that erode out of the white and gray mudstone. They record locations, document geology, prepare specimens carefully in field jackets, and transport them back to laboratories where more detailed analysis can begin. This is the work, patient, slow, often unrewarding in the short term, occasionally producing discoveries of extraordinary significance. The work that has given us everything we know about Quetzalcoatlus, and that will give us everything we will come to know about it in the future. In the badlands of Big Bend, the rock is still giving up its secrets, and somewhere in that rock there may be a Quetzalcoatlus bone waiting to be found that will change what we think we know. The sky above Big Bend is empty of pterosaurs, but the ground beneath it still holds them, patiently, in the way that only stone can be patient across millions of years, without urgency, without expectation, simply present. Waiting for the graduate student with sharp eyes and scientific curiosity, who will walk across the right stretch of eroding badland at the right moment and see something that does not look quite right, and pick it up and ask what it is. There is one final comparison worth making, one that places Quetzalcoatlus not just in the context of prehistoric life, but in the context of the full sweep of animal evolution on this planet. Of all the flying animals that have ever lived, the insects, the pterosaurs, the birds, the bats, none has come close to the absolute size of Quetzalcoatlus northropi. The largest flying insect in history, the carboniferous dragonfly Meganeura, had a wingspan of approximately 65 centimeters, impressive, but 1/10 the wingspan of the giant pterosaur. The largest flying bird of the Cenozoic, Pelagornis sandersi, had a wingspan of approximately 6 to 7 meters, large, but still smaller than the giant Asdarchid. The largest bat, the Eocene Onychonotreris, was tiny by comparison. Nothing has flown larger than Quetzalcoatlus. In 400 million years of vertebrate and insect flight, in 4 separate independent evolutionary experiments with powered aerial locomotion, no lineage has produced an animal that surpassed the size achieved by Quetzalcoatlus in the late Cretaceous of Texas. This fact, the absolute supremacy of Quetzalcoatlus as the largest flying animal in the full history of life, is not a trivial one. It is a statement about what evolution is capable of and about the specific combination of ecological opportunity and biological constraint that produced, in the late Cretaceous, an animal at the very limit of what powered flight can sustain. That limit has not been exceeded in 66 million years, not by the birds that diversified explosively in the Paleogene, not by the bats that filled the nocturnal aerial niches left empty by the pterosaurs, not by anything alive today. The record set by Quetzalcoatlus northropi in the late Cretaceous is the oldest unbroken record in the natural world, the largest flying animal, for 66 million years and counting. Whether it will ever be broken, whether evolution will someday produce a flying animal larger than Quetzalcoatlus, is a question we cannot answer. What we can say is that in 66 million years of trying, it has not happened yet. The feathered serpent set the standard. The sky so far has not surpassed it. This has been Sleepy Dino. Good night. Let us spend our remaining time on something that paleontology rarely discusses directly, but that is always present in the background of any serious engagement with extinct animals. The question of what it means that these animals are gone, and what their absence tells us about the world we inhabit. The sky of the modern world is not empty. It is full of birds, over 10,000 species of them, ranging from the bee hummingbird at 2 grams to the wandering albatross at 10 kilograms. It is full of bats, the nocturnal aerial specialists that diversified after the pterosaurs were gone. It is full of insects, the oldest and most numerous of all flying animals, which have been airborne for 400 million years and show no sign of relinquishing the air. But the sky of the modern world lacks something. It lacks scale. It lacks the aerial gigantism that the late Cretaceous produced, the 10-meter wingspans, the long-necked, crested, fuzzy pterosaurs moving through the air at altitude, crossing continents on flights of extraordinary endurance. Nothing in the modern sky comes close, and the ecological absence of very large soaring pterosaurs is not simply a matter of extinction having removed something that existed. It is a matter of evolution not having rebuilt it in 66 million years. This is striking. Evolution is usually described as filling vacant niches, as producing organisms that exploit any available ecological opportunity. If the niche of very large soaring aerial predator is genuinely available in the modern world, why has nothing evolved to fill it? Part of the answer may be that the niche is not as vacant as it appears. Modern large soaring birds, condors, albatrosses, eagles, occupy the equivalent ecological role at smaller body sizes, and may be useful enough at those smaller sizes that there is no strong selective pressure toward the extreme gigantism of the Asdarchids. The advantages of very large size, longer range, access to larger prey, may not outweigh the costs in the current atmospheric and ecological conditions. Part of the answer may be that the atmospheric conditions of the modern world, the lower oxygen content, the lower air density, make the extreme end of aerial gigantism less aerodynamically feasible than it was in the late Cretaceous. And part of the answer may simply be time. 66 million years sounds like a long time in human terms, but in evolutionary terms, it may not be sufficient for a lineage to work its way from small-bodied flyer to Quetzalcoatl scale giant. The Asdarchids took over 100 million years to reach their maximum size. The birds have been diversifying for 66 million years, roughly the same amount of time. Perhaps, given another 100 million years, the birds will produce something that approaches the Ashdokic scale. We will not be here to see it if it happens, but the possibility is not foreclosed. Evolution is patient, the sky is large, and the selective pressures that produced Quetzalcoatlus, the advantages of size, the efficiency of soaring, the access to vast landscapes that long-range flight provides, have not changed. The feathered serpent is gone, but the sky that made it possible is still here, and the sky, given time, has a way of being filled. The story of Quetzalcoatlus is, in the end, a story about limits, about the limits of what biology can achieve, and about what happens when evolution finds those limits and approaches them with the calm, blind precision of natural selection operating across millions of years. The limit approached by Quetzalcoatlus was the physical limit of powered flight, the ceiling imposed by the laws of aerodynamics and physics on how large a flying animal can be. Quetzalcoatlus northropi appears to have been at or very near that ceiling, an animal operating at the very edge of what the physics of lift and the biology of bone and muscle and metabolism can sustain. It is not surprising that nothing larger has evolved since. The ceiling is real. The physics do not change. An animal larger than Quetzalcoatlus attempting to fly with the same basic biological toolkit would not generate enough lift to stay airborne. What is surprising, what is the true wonder of Quetzalcoatlus, is that evolution found the ceiling at all, that starting from small, agile Triassic theropods barely larger than pigeons, the therosaur lineage worked its way, generation by generation, selection pressure by selection pressure, across 150 million years of evolutionary time, to an animal operating at the very physical limit of what flight can sustain. That journey from pigeon scale to aircraft scale, from the first tentative winged archosaur to the feathered serpent of the late Cretaceous sky, is one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of life on Earth. And we know it happened because the bones are in the rock, because Douglas Lawson found them in 1971, because one Langston recognized them, because Brian Andres and Kevin Hartman and their colleagues spent decades working to understand them, because human curiosity and human science and the patient work of understanding applied to a hollow bone in the Texas desert can reach across 68 million years and bring back the knowledge of an animal that flew over that same desert when it was a Cretaceous floodplain. The sky remembers nothing, the rock remembers everything. And we, standing in the middle between the sky and the rock, are the ones who read the memory. There is a word that keeps coming up when researchers who study Quetzalcoatlus are asked to describe their subject in plain language, not a scientific term, not a measurement or a clay name or a functional description, a simple word that sits outside the technical vocabulary of paleontology that captures something that the technical vocabulary cannot. The word is impossible. Not impossible in the sense of false or fabricated. The bones are real. The animal existed, but impossible in the sense that it violates the intuitions that our experience of the modern world has built into us, the intuitions about how large flying things can be, about what a 10-meter wingspan means on an animal rather than an aircraft, about what it would look like to watch something this large become airborne from a standing start. Our intuitions about flying animals are calibrated on condors and albatrosses and eagles. At the upper end of our experience, a large flying bird has a wingspan of 3.5 meters and weighs perhaps 10 kilograms. The idea of scaling that up by a factor of 3 in wingspan and 25 in mass, while keeping the animal airborne and capable of sustained soaring flight, simply does not compute in the way that most biological facts compute. And yet it is true. The bones say so. The aerodynamic models say so. The fossil record of the late Cretaceous says so clearly and repeatedly. Quetzalcoatlus was impossible, and it was real. This tension between what our intuitions tell us should be possible and what the fossil record tells us actually happened is one of the most productive tensions in paleontology. It forces us to examine the assumptions built into our intuitions. It forces us to ask why we thought something was impossible and whether the reasons were sound. And it forces us to expand our model of what the natural world can do to make room in our understanding for the extraordinary. The natural world does not consult our intuitions before deciding what to produce. It does not check our models before evolving something new. It simply operates blindly and patiently and without limit across geological time, and occasionally produces something that is, by any reasonable standard, impossible. And then it puts the bones in the rock, and eventually we find them. And we learn, again, that the world is stranger and larger, and more extraordinary than we had allowed ourselves to believe. There is one more thing to say about the late Cretaceous sky, about the world above the dinosaurs, the world above the Mosasaur's ocean, the world that Quetzalcoatlus shared with other theropods and the earliest birds. That sky was not empty. It was not dominated by a single giant theropod. It was, like the land and the sea, a complex, species-rich, ecologically diverse environment, a world of multiple theropoid lineages occupying diurn niches, the diurn altitudes, the diurn prey types, the diurn geographical ranges. In the late Cretaceous skies of North America, alongside Quetzalcoatlus, flew smaller theropods of various kinds. Pteranodon, the familiar, crestless, large-beaked, fish-eating theropods that is one of the most commonly depicted prehistoric animals, had already declined by the latest Cretaceous, but its relatives and ecological successors were present. Nyctosaurus, a remarkable pterosaur with an extraordinary tine-like crest, shared the skies over the western interior seaway. Various smaller, less completely known theropods occupied the lower levels of the aerial food web, catching insects and small fish and other small prey. And increasingly, in the latest Cretaceous, birds. The diversification of Cretaceous birds was already well underway by the time of Quetzalcoatlus. The enantiornithines, a group of birds that would not survive the KPG extinction, were diverse and abundant, occupying many of the ecological niches in the aerial world that modern birds occupy today. The ornithurine birds, the lineage that would survive and radiate into the modern avian diversity, were present and diversifying. The late Cretaceous sky was a sky in transition. The theropods, dominant for over 150 million years, were sharing their domain with the birds, a new lineage, diurn in anatomy and flight style, already proving capable of competing for aerial resources. The transition was not complete. The pterosaurs were not yet declining in the way that would have been necessary for birds to be simply replacing them, but the coexistence of the two groups in the same sky was already a preview of the world that would follow. After the extinction, the sky belonged to birds and bats. Before the extinction, it belonged to pterosaurs and birds together, in a complex, species-rich aerial community that we are still only beginning to understand. Quetzalcoatlus was the largest member of that community, the giant at the top of the aerial food web, the animal that cast the largest shadow when it passed between the sun and the Cretaceous landscape below. Unlike everything else in the late Cretaceous world, it was extraordinary, and like everything else, it was temporary. The sky above us today is the sky that survived, diurent from the late Cretaceous sky, emptier of giants, but built on the same atmosphere, lit by the same sun, governed by the same physical laws that made Quetzalcoatlus possible. The sky endures, the animals in it change, and we, looking up from the ground, are lucky enough to know something about what used to be there.